Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk entitled, Are you gonna study registered differences or will you neglect them? Expressions of future temporal reference in English revisited. My name is Alexandra Engel, and in the next 20 minutes, I will try to convince you that registered differences are worthwhile to be studied from a variationist perspective because register moderates probabilistic constraints involved in grammatical choice making. This paper examines the effect of register on the choice of expressions of future temporal reference in British English. For example, I can say, this year's NWAV will be very interesting. Or I can say, this year's NWAV is gonna be very interesting. And both sentences have the same meaning. Previous research has shown that the choice of future time expression is conditioned by several language internal constraints, such as whether the token occurs in a main or a subclause, or whether it is in a declarative or interrogative sentence. And this variable has been studied extensively across communities and across time, or also in terms of lexical specificities, which elucidate the trajectory of the grammaticalization of these future time expressions. And apart from that, register differences have also been found in terms of frequencies of occurrence, such that be going to was found to be more frequent in informal corpora than in formal corpora in American English. But what has not been studied yet is whether these registered differences are also probabilistic in nature. That is, whether register modulates the internal constraints involved. For example, is the effect of clause type the same in spoken informal language as in written formal language? And this has something to do with the common assumption in variationist social linguistics that, and I quote William Labov, internal constraints are normally independent of social and stylistic factors. Likewise, Gregory Guy states that stylistic variation is quantitatively simple, involving raising or lowering the selection frequency of socially sensitive variables without altering other grammatical constraints on variant selection. So in this paper, I'd like to challenge this assumption. But of course, I must note that register is a special case of stylistic variation because so far the focus of variationist research has been on spoken language and in particular the vernacular, and therefore also on phonological variation. But what happens when we look at the morphosyntactic variable and when we contrast spoken language with written language? This brings me to the research questions of this paper. The first question is whether language users employ probabilistic constraints differently in different registers. Second, if we do find such probabilistic registered differences, do we find larger differences between the two communication modes, spoken versus written, or between formal and informal registers? And third, can corpus findings be corroborated experimentally? And to tackle these questions, the methodology combines a variationist corpus study with a rating task experiment. In this rating task experiment, native speakers gave a gradient rating as to which of the two variants sounds more natural given the context. But yeah, why should we employ such a twofold methodology in the first place? In the corpus study, we model authentic language use. And in the experiment, we measure probabilistic knowledge of language users. And this combination of methods is interesting because if we find similar patterns in both sources of evidence, we can draw firmer conclusions about our results. All right, now I'd like to present the corpus study in which I examine 4 registers of British English. And register is operationalized at the intersection of formality and mode. I aimed for widely recognizable registers. So in the spoken mode, I selected conversations between family members and friends on the informal side of the continuum, and I used a spoken BNC 2014. This register can also be seen as the equivalent to the vernacular. And as formal counterpart, I selected parliamentary debates from the House of Commons. And in the written mode, I chose the British English block parts of the Globe corpus and newspaper articles from the Independent as written formal register. And all these registers provide synchronic data. I then created a random balance sample of 2,600 tokens. So that means that there were 650 tokens per register, and half of the tokens are tokens of the will variant and the other half of be going to. This decision for balanced sample was made because we are not interested in the rates of occurrence here, but in the probabilistic conditioning of the variant choice in each of these registers. The definition of a variable context is in line with recent studies and the principle of accountability. I then annotated the tokens for the language internal constraints that are known to influence a choice, such as sentence type or clause type. And for the annotation procedure, I followed previous studies on this variable. Then I fitted a logistic mixed effects regression model to predict the choice of a variant as a function of these language internal constraints. And importantly, I included interactions with register. I didn't include any other external social constraints, for example, gender, because on the one hand, the previous studies have not found any consistent effects. And on the other hand, it was also not possible given the nature of the data. But I included random effects for speaker and for lexical verb to account for possible idiosyncrasies. The resulting model found main effects, which are largely in line with research. And more importantly, the model also found considerable variability across registers, in that there are interactions between register and 5 language internal constraints, namely grammatical person of a subject, polarity, lexical verb type, proximity of future time reference, and presence of temporal adverb. So these language internal constraints interacted with register, and the patterns of the interactions show that the differences between spoken and written modes are more pronounced than between formal and informal registers. And more precisely, in all 5 interactions, the difference between the effect found in the spoken informal register and the written formal register was significant. And in 4 out of the 5, the difference between written informal and spoken informal was significant. While spoken formal register and spoken informal registers only significantly differed in their effects in 2 of these interactions. So unfortunately, I cannot go into much detail about the results, but here I'd like to present one of the effects, namely the interaction between register and proximity of future time reference. On the y-axis, you can see the probability of be going to, and on the x-axis, the different registers. So what immediately becomes apparent here is that the differences between distal, proximate, and unspecific reference contexts are leveled in the spoken informal register, while there are clear differences in the 2 written registers. In that proximate contexts clearly favor be going to compared to distal contexts. All right, now I'd like to move on to the experiment. And this experiment was designed to test whether language users have probabilistic knowledge of different registers. The methodology was inspired by a study by Bresson and Ford, and participants were asked to rate both variants in corpus excerpts in terms of how natural the variants sound to them. The experiment was conducted as a web-based survey, and 140 British English native speakers took part. For the study, I selected two registers, which were most distinct in the corpus study, namely spoken informal and written formal. I didn't include all registers because this would have made the experiment much longer and very tiring for the participants. And as a result, the data quality would have suffered. So the two registers were presented in blocks and also with visual primes. But to account for possible order effects, there were two versions of the experiment. So version A began with the written formal register, and then all the items of the spoken informal register followed. And in version B, it was the other way around. But importantly, each participant only saw one version of the experiment. And in addition to the items with a choice, I also included 8 simple yes-no comprehension questions about the corpus excerpts to ensure that participants actually read the excerpts. To make this all a bit clearer, here's an example of a trial from a newspaper register. So the layout was designed to mimic the original layout of that register. And as you can see, both variants are presented in the context of the excerpt. And below, the participants were presented with a slider bar, and they can drag the slider to either of the variants, or they can also put it in the middle if they don't have a preference. And importantly, there were also 2 lists in which the presentation side of the original variant was counterbalanced. So if here the will variant is presented on the right side, another participant saw a version of this item in which will was presented on the left side. And this is an example trial of the spoken informal register. For the spoken informal register, I opted for a written representation to not introduce speaker-related idiosyncrasies. But the spoken character is ensured in that false starts and hesitations were kept. And I only edited these excerpts minimally. So for example, the 3 dots indicate a pause. All right, so there were 32 authentic corpus excerpts that served as material for the experiment. And in both registers, there were 2 different types of items. So 10 register sensitive filler items. And these filler items served as a manipulation check. And then there were also 6 target items. So in the filler items, there were 2 different types. There were 6 items with a choice between the relativizers which and that, and 4 items with a lexical choice, for example, notion versus idea. These fillers were included as a manipulation check because we should see higher ratings for the formal variant, for example, which notion, in the formal register. And the target items were carefully chosen so that they come from the whole probability range. And I also ensured that lexical verbs following a future marker were not verbs that often collocate with will and be going to. And this was based on the corpus analysis. And I also made sure that there were no other will or be going to occurrences in the context of the target utterance or sentence, because this would potentially prime the participants. All right, so I fitted linear regression models on the rating data, and I first like to present the results of the filler data. because these fillers were included to check whether the register manipulation worked in the way it was intended. And indeed, the analysis shows that the formal variant, so which or notion, for example, received higher ratings in the written formal register compared to the spoken informal register. And on top of that, there was also a difference between the two filler types. So formal variants of lexical items were rated higher compared to the formal variants of the relativized items. And this is also in line with what we expected, because lexical items should trigger stronger register-related responses than the relativizers. And with this encouraging finding in mind, so the register manipulation worked, I'd like to present the results on the target items involving a choice between will and be going to. So this plot here shows the ratings by the participants on the y-axis plotted against the corpus-based probability for be going to. And you can see that the regression line has a positive slope. And that means that the higher the probability for be going to, the higher the ratings of the participants. So this positive correlation means that corpus evidence and experimental evidence converge, and that we can be confident that language users have knowledge of probabilistic effects in different registers. So now I'd like to come back to the research questions, and we can now answer the first one, that indeed there are considerable differences, probabilistic differences with regard to register. So register modulates the effects of 5 out of 9 language internal constraints. So that means that the effects differ in, for example, written registers compared to the effects found in the vernacular. And that brings me to the next question, whether mode or formality plays a greater role. And I can answer this question with regard to this particular case study, that more variability in probabilistic constraints was found between the two modes, spoken versus written. And with regard to the third question, we saw that corpus evidence and experimental evidence converge in the sense that we find that language users have probabilistic knowledge about the choice of future temporal expressions in different registers. And actually, these register differences are quantitatively complex. And that is contrary to what has been assumed before. And I would like to conclude this with my take-home message that register differences in probabilistic choice making are quantitatively complex. So what does this mean? As Gregory Guy put it, such probabilistic register differences can be seen as equivalent to diglossic or bilingual behavior rather than simple stylizing within one language. So that means that we should actually rethink custom social linguistic theorizing with regard to register differences, and we should study grammatical variation also beyond the vernacular and in contrast, contrast different situations of language use. All right, now finally, I'd like to thank everyone who has helped me in this project, my supervisors, Benedict Smericiani, Jason Grafmiller, Laura Rosel, and Freek van der Velde, as well as special thanks to Elsie Andries, who helped me with the data collection. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to receive your questions at the discussions sessions on register, as well as morphology and morphosyntax at NWAV. And of course, you can always contact me via email at alexander.engel@kuleuven.be. And these are my references. Thank you.